God as being with an uppercase B rather than as a being with a lowercase b. Over the last few weeks, I've been telling some of the story of my own personal theological journey. Today is another episode, maybe the final episode. We'll see. I'd come to the point in my thinking when I could not accept the notion of an interventionist God. According to this concept, God steps in occasionally to contravene the laws of nature in order to make something happen that would not otherwise have happened. These would be what we might call miracles, events that couldn't be explained in terms of the normal processes of cause and effect within the universe, events which broke the rules of nature. It seemed to me that if you did believe in an interventionist God, this opened one or more can of worms. First of all, you'd always be asking, why did God intervene in this situation but not that one? It also seemed to me that such interventions would be a violation of the integrity of the natural world. Something that otherwise would have been, for example, no longer would be. Remember, God's actions would not be like the actions of human beings. You might argue that we human beings intervene in the natural world all the time, and that's true, but we do so within the confines of the laws of the universe. We don't break those laws. Anything we do is, by definition, within the possibilities permitted by the nature of the universe. They are always natural. God's intervention, on the other hand, would be a violation of the natural world at a much deeper level. Another consequence would be that we could no longer rely on the laws that operate within the universe. If God could step in at any time and change or violate those laws, how could we be sure of anything? This would undermine science. If I carry out an experiment and don't get the result I expect, how do I know whether this was because my theory was incorrect or because God interfered? Science, and indeed daily life, depends on the consistency and predictability of the world around us. Finally, I saw no compelling evidence for anything that could be identified definitively as an intervention by God. Others would dispute this, of course, I know that, but I had never seen anything of the kind. But if we lived in a world where such interventions or miracles were possible, how could we ever know anyway what was natural and what was not? It seemed much safer to me to assume that such interventions did not occur. Okay, so no interventionist God. What options did that leave me? Well, one option was deism. According to deism, God initially created the world and pushed the start button, then left it to its own devices. He never intervened subsequently. However, such a God didn't seem very interesting to me. I think this path leads to practical, if not philosophical, atheism. God is irrelevant to me in this model. There were, of course, theologians who explored other possibilities, and one that caught my eye was the notion of God as being with an uppercase B, not a being, but being itself. The philosopher and Lutheran theologian Paul Tillich introduced the concept of God as being in itself, or as the ground of being. According to this theology, God is not a being among beings, but is that which makes all existence possible. Every actual being participates in this ground of being. John Macquarie, a 20th century Scottish Anglican theologian, developed these ideas further. He preferred to refer to God as being rather than as the ground of being or as being itself, although the latter seems to me to be basically the same idea. According to this theology, every actual being expresses or embodies being to a greater or lesser extent. A rock, for instance, participates in being, but not to the degree, say, of a tree. And a tree perhaps not so much as an animal. And other animals not so much as human beings. And, well, do you see where this is going? The ultimate expression of being within creation, according to this way of thinking, is Jesus Christ. This is how Macquarie and others like him would understand the incarnation. Jesus Christ fully expresses or incarnates being in the world. It's worth noting that this idea is perhaps not as new or as radical as it might at first seem to be. Traditional theology has always understood God to be the creator of the universe in two senses. In the first sense, he is the creator or cause of all things at the beginning, setting the ball rolling, so to speak. This is in fieri causality. It's the kind of causality we observe, for instance, when the cue ball hits the 8 ball. The impact sets the 8 ball in motion, but this motion is subsequently independent of the cue ball. The cue ball could cease to exist upon impact with the 8 ball, and this would make no difference at all to the 8 ball's motion. This is the kind of causality which, when applied to God, results in deism. But because theologians have always been aware of the inadequacy of deism, they also conceived of God as creator in another sense, namely as that which sustains the existence of the universe. This is known as in esse causality. The analogy usually used to explain this is that of the candle flame and the light it emits. The light only exists as long as the flame burns. Extinguish the flame, and the light disappears. God's sustaining of the world is understood in this sense, that he constantly maintains all of reality in existence. Now, it seems fairly clear to me that Macquarie and Tillich are using being in this same sense. But what's actually gained by that? Why not just use the word God? I suspect that this may have some PR value. The term being is less loaded than the word God. It's also familiar to philosophers from existentialist philosophy, like the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, in his book Being and Nothingness. So perhaps we can sneak what is pretty much the same idea as God past our readers by using this term. But does it work? Whether you use the word God or the word being, does it work? Well, first of all, I think the candle analogy breaks down. When you look more closely at a candle, I think you'll find that the emission of each individual photon, what we call light, is actually caused by a preceding event. I.e., this is in fact in fieri causation, just as with the cue ball and the 8 ball. It's not in esse causation. When you look more closely, what appears to be in esse creation, in fact reduces to in fieri causation. I would argue that the only type of causation that we actually observe in the universe is this in fieri causation. So, if we don't actually observe in esse creation in the universe, applying this as an analogy to God's relationship with the universe loses some of its force. Secondly, does this being language have any meaning at all? I suspect there are the same problems here that we encountered in a previous video when trying to apply our language, and particularly the verb to be, to the concept of nothing. I think the same problems arise when we try to speak of being. It's not possible to say meaningfully that being is. Being is not a being, and the verb to be can only be applied to beings. Indeed, these theologians would argue quite strongly that God or being is not, in fact, a being, and it cannot be said of being that it exists. To say so would be to reduce being, with a capital B, to a being. Thus, these theists and atheists actually agree. God does not exist. Somehow, though, the theologian thinks that by saying God does not exist, this makes God more than a being, somehow more real than actual beings. Whereas the atheist would think that by saying God does not exist, they are saying that God is less than a being, something less than real beings. So, within this framework, theists and atheists can use exactly the same word to make diametrically opposed claims. God does not exist. On this we are agreed, but we mean totally different things by this. Then there's the question of whether this being with a capital B can actually be identified with God at all. Well, is there any compelling reason to do so? Supposing, despite our reservations about this kind of language, supposing that we nevertheless accept that ideas such as being is expressed in beings actually have some real meaning, would we then be justified in identifying this with what all men call God? It seems not to me without some additional information, without in fact some kind of revelation. Being equals God does not appear to me to be a logical necessity. Even less so the equation being equals the Judeo-Christian God. This requires external validation, some kind of revelation. I'm sure John Macquarie at least would have agreed with me about this. Another issue, at least with Macquarie's model, is that it presupposes some kind of hierarchy of being. That a tree, for instance, has more isness than a rock, and that an animal has more isness than a tree, and so on up the hierarchy until we get to Jesus, who has the most isness of all. But is this hierarchical understanding of being justified? It has a kind of initial intuitive appeal, I'll admit that, but I wonder whether it holds up under closer scrutiny. For example, does a quark express being more fully or less fully than the proton that three quarks together go to make up? Sure, this is not just about size, but perhaps it is about complexity. The more complex a thing is, the more isness it's supposed to have, the more it expresses being. But what about a star? Does that express more or less being than a rock? This seems to be a grey area to me. Or what about a black hole? Perhaps the measure here is entropy. The less entropy a system, and here read being, the less entropy a system has, the more it expresses being with a capital B, or in more traditional terms, God. Is this the case? It's not clear to me that it is. But again, for argument's sake, let's suppose that this is right. What about Jesus, though, in this system? How can we be sure that Jesus is the fullest incarnation of being in creation, the most complete expression of being? We surely wouldn't know a priori what this would look like, would we? And given that we ourselves are human and therefore assume that we express more being than a jellyfish, is our perspective unbiased? It seems to me that we could not know that Jesus was this ultimate expression of being within creation without some kind of external validation, some kind of revelation. Again, I don't think Macquarie would necessarily have disagreed with this. But isn't Jesus himself supposed to be this revelation? This ultimate revelation of being, or if you prefer, God, in the world? But how could we know that unless either, on the one hand, we already knew what that revelation would look like, in which case we didn't need the revelation, it's superfluous, or, on the other hand, we needed another source outside Jesus to tell us that Jesus was in fact this expression of being in the world, which would seem to be another revelation alongside Jesus, which is not Jesus himself. And I don't think that's supposed to happen. Okay, there's a lot in there. There's a lot to unpack. And I know I've drifted away somewhat from just describing my own personal theological journey. Except, of course, that this was exactly the kind of question I was wrestling with. Most people won't venture down these pathways, but I felt obliged to pursue these kinds of ideas. All the time I was struggling to find a concept of God that made sense to me. There are many, of course, who would argue that this doesn't have to make sense, or perhaps even shouldn't, that I should just take all this on faith. Basically, they would argue that I should stop thinking. But this would be to deny my fundamental nature, which I would not and will not do. Again, I know that there are many who would argue that this is precisely what I should do. I refuse. For a while, I could live with this reinterpretation of the traditional concept of God as being in itself, or simply as being. But I don't think it ultimately solves the problem with the God concept. It just hides these problems behind a new terminology. Consider these two possibilities. First of all actual beings are maintained in existence by being, or God, and every being expresses being to some degree. Or, secondly, beings are self-sustaining. What observable difference would there be between these two realities? I would suggest that there would be no difference at all. There is no empirical way of testing these different possibilities. The universe would look and behave in exactly the same way. So why then posit another level? Let's use Occam's razor here. In the end, I don't think being, with a capital B, otherwise known as God, is even a meaningful concept. It's verbal legerdemain. It may fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time.